Guys, and welcome back to my channel. Have you ever wanted to feel like a princess, or ever wanted to kind of make yourself a really cool, like full skirt, ruffles, princess vibes dress? Well, you came to the right video because that's exactly what we're gonna do today. And the best method for this in particular today, at least for me, was draping. But of course, you can always make this out of a block pattern as well, especially when I'm going to show you how the pattern, the draped pattern, looks like laid out on the table. You can kind of see what to do in a block pattern as well if you want to go that route. So whatever method you choose to do, everything is fine. In this video, we're going to go the draping route, and I hope you're going to enjoy. Let's start with the video. So I started today's video actually with draping. I haven't draped in a very long time and I really felt like draping again. So I'm really sorry if you do not have a dress form that fits your body, or if you do not have like any dress form at all, but I do like draping, so that's a very creative method for me. That's why I decided to drape the dress and the pattern of the dress. But for everybody who does have a dress form that is fitted to their body or close to their measurements, it's very easy to actually drape the pattern that you are seeing right there. So I went ahead and aligned the center front line, so the straight line in the very middle of the dress form, with the selvage edge of my draping piece, my fabric that I am putting on the dress form. I put a few lines onto the fabric itself for orientation, so the center front, then also the bust line, the neckline, and so on and so forth, and put my first dart into my waistline. That's to shape the bust and also the waist, and it's a very standard just vertical dart that you see in almost every pattern. I also went ahead and shaped the bust a bit more with a small bust dart which goes horizontally into the side seam, and added all the lines that I need after I take off my pattern to put it on the table and refine the lines and stuff. When I was done with that, I decided that I wanted to do a small cutout, which I haven't done yet in any pattern before, so that was a really interesting thing to do. I decided on a straight leg neckline, which just goes horizontally from the center front into my arm cutout, and then 3 to 4 centimeter straps that I will be attaching my sleeves on. For the center back part, I did exactly the same thing. I was able to take out the dart in the center back, so my whole back piece is just one whole piece, which is really nice, and then I continued the cutout into the waistline in the center back. And then the most fun part is to take out all the pins and just lay out the pattern flat on the surface, because it looks really cool and you see how your dress is shaped basically. To me that's always really fun. And I continue to refine the lines again. I'm doing this with a red marker so you can see actually, and also myself, I can see better what I'm doing, and I just draw out the darts in a neat way. I draw out all of the other lines, so side seam, neckline, waistline, whatever as well, so I can go ahead and cut out the pattern out of my fabric. In between this, I went to Illustrator and made a digital pattern out of the one that you saw me drape, and made this mock-up. There were a few things that I didn't like. For example, the sleeves made these really weird ruffles as if it was not enough fabric there. So that's one thing that I already changed. There's just a bit more fabric that I have to give into the curve that ends up being in the shoulder strap. That's the only change that I did, because everything else to me looks really neat. The back looks amazing if you ask me. I decided on a ruffled up circle skirt, so this one is actually too big for the waist, that it got ruffled up to fit, which is a really nice way of giving extra volume into the skirt itself. And then I also added these cute ruffles that you saw in the first shot. With all of my patterns, you always have to scale all of my PDF patterns to 100%. There is a test score that you need to measure. It needs to measure either 5 centimeters or 1 inch. That indicates if your printout is actually correct. So do a test print. On page 1 there's that square to test it, and then go ahead and print out all of the remaining pages in a scale of 100. And then you only have to put page next to page, like edge to edge. You do not have to cut anything away. If you do so, your pattern will not fit you anymore because it's not true to size anymore. There are gonna be some gaps in between the corners of the page, like page to page, where the diamonds are, and that is just how printers work. I can't really do anything about it to avoid, unless I make you cut out every page individually, which I personally do not like, because it's just an extra step to get a pattern and it's more wasteful because you can't fit that much on a page anymore. So if you have any troubles, you can always go to your computer and compare the pages to the one on your screen and then just draw in the lines that are missing. I also updated my printing instructions more or less to the general information PDF, where you can find all of these things again written down with like pictures and stuff. If you need any help at all, that should be something you can refer to. So I'm finally done with cutting out everything. I cut out all of my pieces out of my fashion fabric and also out of my lining, which is this pretty green color. I've used it plenty of times before, and it actually looks really, really good underneath the semi-transparent fashion fabric that I will be using. Because it is transparent or semi-transparent, I obviously can't use interfacing, which is written on each pattern piece that needs it. If you can, I would suggest to put interfacing on all the pattern pieces that it's written on, because the dress in the end will just look way better with interfacing. I can't do that, and you usually don't put interfacing on lining, so plus it will be visible through the transparency of my fashion fabric. Therefore, I'm not going to do interfacing. I will be first focusing on the fashion fabric itself, and more specifically on the bodice. This dress is a bit different to the other dresses that I have done because it has this big waist cut out right here, and I think that's going to be a really, really fun and cute detail. Other than that, it doesn't really vary too much from how to put a bodice together. Usually you just put each dividing seam together, side seam, and then we're going to continue with the sleeves. So the first thing that I'm going to do is taking my front piece and putting that right sides together with my side front pieces to close the front dividing seam. So that's the one that goes over the bust point. There is a notch drawn into the pattern, so you should have no problem putting these very different lines together. And that's what I'm gonna do. If you're using like any kind of special fabric, like this one has lace in between, like tulle lace, it's so important to do an ironing test, because I have mine now on the setting that I usually iron with. And look what happens if I steam this piece. It completely melted the tulle. Therefore, I know now that the setting is too hot, and it's really important to test this on a rest piece that you have from cutting out your pattern, and to adjust your ironing heat, because the next thing that we're gonna do is ironing our actual bodice. And I will use my trusty tailor's hem, and I'm gonna iron all of the seam allowance towards the side seam, so away from the center front. And next up, we're gonna put the back pieces onto the bodice itself. So we're gonna close the side seam, and we're just gonna put right sides together as well and stitch down the side seam. And that's already all that we have to do for the bodice. Next up are the sleeves, which are two pattern pieces, the sleeve itself and then the shoulder strap. We're going to start off with preparing the shoulder strap, which is just ironing the pieces in half. And then also ironing the seam allowance of one long side of each of the shoulder straps to the inside. And now once these are prepared, we can continue with the sleeve piece itself. So on the pattern you will find two measurements that you need to consider, because the upper and the lower part will be gathered. The upper part will be gathered by sewing, and the lower part will be gathered with an elastic. So two different things, because this, in the end, the upper part will be gathered down to the length of the shoulder strap, which we will sew onto this later on. And the lower part is, for comfort, done with an elastic. So cut down the elastic to the size that is written on the hem of your sleeve, or go ahead and measure your upper arm circumference. You can do that too if you prefer. That's probably the more precise way to go. So do that, and then we will continue with the sleeve. So the first thing that we're gonna do is gather the upper edge to the size of your strap. And I do that as usual with just stitching into the seam allowance with my biggest stitch without back tacking. I do that twice so the ruffles get nicer and neater. Once the sleeve is prepared and ruffled up, you can actually go ahead and pin the unironed side of the shoulder strap, right sides together with the wrong side of your sleeve pattern, and stitch at 1 centimeter. Once done with that, you actually want to flip around the shoulder strap and put the already pre-ironed side of your strap onto the right side of your sleeve and top stitch it closely to the folded corner. And that makes a really, really nice and neat finishing for the sleeve. For the elastic, we're actually going to go ahead and sew a tunnel. So I'm folding my hem seam allowance 1 centimeter twice and then top stitching very closely to the inward corner, and then I can use a safety pin to feed the elastic into the tunnel. You do not have to bar tack the elastic into place because we are going to close the side seams right now. So there you find a notch in the side seam which divides the side seam and the front or back sleeve seam. So this is very similar to my puff dress pattern. Basically it's the same, just without a lining. You only want to sew from the hem towards the notch, because the other remaining seams are gonna be used to put the sleeve onto the bodice. So put a needle right there where the notch is, you'll find that in the pattern as well, and then put right sides together of the sleeve side seam and actually go ahead and stitch that shut. I like to iron in between every step, so that's what I do. I am ironing the seam allowance towards the back sleeve side, basically. So just go ahead, as they are mirrored, back and front side of the sleeve is mirrored. You just go ahead and iron. Okay, Alexa didn't ask you, but that's fine. You can just go ahead and iron one sleeve seam allowance to one side and the other one to the other side, and it should be fine. I actually went ahead and overlocked that seam because it's gonna be exposed, so I figured just overlocking it would make it nicer. And now it's the time to cut towards the seam, which is gonna make this notch a twisting or turning point. So I'm doing that for both of the sleeves, like just right into the seam allowance so that it's gonna end where the seam starts. And now you can twist it around so that the front and back sleeve seam actually make one straight line, which we're going to use for putting the sleeves onto the bodice in the next step. I like to lay my bodice wrong sides down and then just have the side seam right in front of me and then match up the seam allowance where the turning point is. So just there in the side seam, up with the side seam of my bodice. I'm putting a sleeve and bodice right sides together, putting some needles in and then just going along the sleeve seam until the shoulder strap. There should be notches in the bodice which match up perfectly with the shoulder straps in the front and the back, as you can see right there. I just match them up and go ahead and stitch the sleeve onto the bodice at a little bit less than 1 centimeter. So I'm stitching actually into the seam allowance because once the lining will get attached, that's actually going to be stitched at 1 centimeter so that you do not see the more or less like basting or helping stitch to attach the sleeve now. Okay, so now that the top is almost done, it just needs to be lined, and we're going to make the bodice out of lining fabric exactly the same way as for the outer fabric. So I'm just gonna do that off camera really quickly and come back to you once I'm done with it. Okay, so that's the lining, that's done as well. And we're gonna take the outer and we're gonna put right sides together with the right side of the lining. And that's gonna make our sleeves get sandwiched in between. That's how it's supposed to be. So just align all seams and then stitch along the neckline. Once done with that, I decided to understitch my neckline, so you basically just stitch your seam allowance onto the lining very closely to the previous stitch, and that just helps while ironing and also when wearing the lining to fall where it's supposed to be, so always like underneath the outer fabric, that it's not going to be visible on the neckline, and ironing it accordingly also helps with that. So the next thing is that we have to turn over the cutout right here. And I guess the easiest is, because we're gonna leave the small waistline pieces that are still there, we're gonna leave that open to attach the waistband. We're just gonna go inside and grab the seam allowances right sides together, either from the center back or from the center front. So I'm just gonna go ahead and grab the two side seams like this, right sides together, and then just take it out of the center back. So I'm gonna put the seam allowances together, the side seam together, put a needle in, and then go ahead and align the cut out seam allowance and pin that accordingly. And as you can see right here, it gets very, very weird and messy really quickly, but we can try to take more stuff out and to even sew the whole cutout in one piece in one go, which can be possible. And it actually is possible, so I'm gonna stitch right to that corner up until here. Like this. It looks very confusing now, but we're gonna go ahead and stitch down all of this up until the next corner. And then when we turn this whole piece back around, we actually close the cutout right there. That's just gonna get ironed nicely in place. I'm not gonna understitch this one because it's just very hard to get there. You might need to cut down your seam allowance or cut into your seam allowance to iron the curve nicely here, but my outer fabric is elastic, and on top of that it's also laying on the bias as it's a curve, so it's probably just easing into how you iron it, how you place it, and it should be fine. But just in case you have any problems ironing, just cut into the seam allowance towards the seam and you will see that it lays much easier. And that's that. And you can do exactly the same on the other side. Before we continue with anything else, we're actually gonna put the ruffles for the hem together. So we have 4 of these pieces and we're gonna ruffle up these pieces once they're sewn together. So first thing that we're gonna do is sew all of these panels together so that we have one very long panel, and then we're gonna ruffle it up. So we're gonna sew along each dividing seam here. After I'm done sewing all of the dividing seams of my ruffles together, I attached my ruffle foot and went just nuts, to be honest. Obviously, you can also do this with the other method that I already showed you. It's gonna be exactly the same. Just make sure to also hem the ruffles before you attach them, or also before you ruffle them up. It's way easier that way. I folded 5mm up twice and top stitched. That's what it's gonna end up looking, and I don't know if it fits yet. We're gonna make it fit to the skirt itself once the skirt is put together. So we're gonna put the ruffles aside and go ahead and sew the skirt together. We have 3 pieces, the front, which lays on fold, which is a bit bigger, and then we have the 2 back pieces. So all we have to do is close the side seams, and then we're gonna ruffle them up as well. I decided to overlock the dividing seams of the skirt. Not that it's necessary because it's going to get a lining as well, but I just thought it's going to be nicer because it's a lengthy part of the skirt that would be exposed, so I went ahead and overlocked it. And now, since everything is put together and ironed nicely, we can go ahead and put the ruffles onto the hem, the right sides together. There are notches in the hem of the skirt to help you put the ruffles together, as twice the length of the ruffle is going onto the skirt pieces. So there is, in the middle of every skirt panel, there is a notch. Go ahead and use that to put the skirt together and then sew the ruffles onto the skirt hem. So the next step is putting the skirt on. And I have thought a lot about how to put the skirt on in the smartest way, because we have the issue that makes this a bit harder and a bit, I don't know, more difficult to figure this out, because we have those waist cutouts. Therefore, the lining has already been attached to the bodice. And that leads to a very, very tiny space of maneuvering for the zipper once it's on, to sew everything nicely and neatly, that the seam allowances are tucked away underneath the lining how you would normally do it. If I give you an example for this, it would be my puff dress, which I made in exactly that way. So I have my lining right here flipped under the upper layer, the fashion fabric, which is my silk here, so that nothing on the inside where my zipper is visible. And that's the optimal way of how to finish a dress. As you can see, this one obviously doesn't have cutouts, and you can completely just go into the lining from between the 2 skirts. Now, with the dress that we are working on right now, we have a limited space to twist and turn everything around, which would be this small space right here in the back. So we would have to somehow finish this in the way that I just showed you, through this hole, optionally through the center front, which is also not quite big. So I was thinking that probably the easiest and still okay way to do it, because it also has a pro to it, is to put everything together and leave the back open, and then just sew the zipper in with both layers at the same time, so that the zipper seam allowance will cover the seam allowance of both the layers. So we're gonna cut it down to like 5mm, and then the zipper will end up covering the seam allowance, the raw edge of both layers. So the pro for that is, since I am working with a transparent fabric, if I were to normally sew this in, you would totally see the zipper band right here, because it is see-through. So that's the one pro, because we're folding it like this, the seam allowance won't be visible on the outside. It will be visible on the inside underneath the zipper. If you are a pro at sewing, or you know what I am talking about, and you know how to maneuver around and stuff, please go ahead and do the first option that I was talking about, because it is the more professional way. But I am going to do the latter, as it's the easier way, and everything is on the inside. That would be, you know, unprofessional. So I'm gonna go with that one. And what we have to do for that is prepare the waistline pattern pieces. So we have 2 pattern pieces, one in the lining fabric and one in the fashion fabric, and we're gonna prepare them in the very exact way. So we are choosing either long side to be up or down, and we're gonna go ahead and iron the seam allowance on one longer side up, and we're gonna do exactly the same for the lining as well. I will go ahead and iron like 1.2 centimeters or something like that up for the lining, because then everything will lay better when we put the final top stitching in, as we're going to have less problems and the lining won't show on the outer side. The next thing that you have to do is prepare your lining skirt. I already went ahead and made it. It is done exactly in the same way as the fashion fabric skirt, minus the ruffles at the end. So you're only gonna have that one circle skirt pattern that you're gonna put together as usual, so just the side seams, and then you're gonna hem it in your preferred method. I opted for the 5 millimeters, like folded twice and then top stitching as I usually do, and that's that. So nothing else is done yet because we're gonna do that together with the outer skirt. So I'm gonna take my outer skirt, put right sides down, and then I'm gonna take my lining skirt and put the seam allowances and stuff onto the outer fabric. And then I'm just gonna put them together and align the pattern pieces, and then I'm gonna ruffle everything at the same time. That's gonna reduce bulk because the ruffles will be, you know, doing the same folds at the same time, whereas when you would do it separately, you would have double the thickness of the skirt. And you're gonna ruffle it down to the size of your waistband. And now that the skirt is gathered, we can sandwich the skirt in between the two waistbands while making sure that the lining goes right sides together with the right side of the lining, and the outer fabric goes right sides together with the outer fabric. And now that the skirt and the waistband are together, we can go ahead and put the bodice into this equation as well. And I am going to do this by putting right sides of the lining together. And you should find notches in the waistband that align with the placements of the bodice. So I'm gonna align the center front and then the 2 points where the openings start, like this. And then since we already ironed everything to prepare for this step, we can do everything at once. So I'm gonna put the lining side down, for me just because it's easier, since my outer fabric is the one that's less easy to iron. And I'm gonna put pins in that go over the folded outer layer of the waistband into the bodice, and then also over the folded side of the lining of the waistband. And that way I can top stitch this seam close in one go without having to do anything else. And now you see why it was important to iron the lining side a bit more, because now the outer layer just goes over top of the fold of the lining layer by just a tiny bit, which makes the lining disappear just like that. I'm going to do the same for the other side. As you can see, the fold lays a tiny bit more to the inside. That's why you have to be careful. Or alternatively, which is probably the smarter idea, just stitch from the lining side so you know where to catch the lining. And it should end up looking something like this. As you can see, it looks really, really nice if you do it in this way. Next up, we're actually gonna put the zipper in. So just treat this as one fabric and put your zipper in. I'm using this white inseam zipper, and you should find a notch on either the lining or the outer fabric, which indicates to which point you should sew the zipper in, which I'm just quickly going to do off camera. I have loads of videos where I'm actually showing how to put a zipper in. I'm going to link one up here in the eye, and this is the timestamp where to go. And the last step is to close the remaining center back, and that we're gonna do twice. So we're gonna put the outer layer and the lining layer together separately. We're gonna do that like through in between the two skirts, as those are gonna stay open. So just put right sides together until the notch that we cut into just a second ago, and put the center back together first for the outer layer and then also for the lining layer. I chose to iron the seam in the center back open and to not overlock it. You can do either or, it doesn't really matter. That's what I did, and I just went ahead and ironed both the lining and the outer fabric open, as I just said, so that everything lays really nicely. And make sure to have cut into the seam allowance right where the notch is, as I said previously, because that's going to assure that your fabric is going to lay really nice and flat on the center back. The last step that I did was to just bar tack on a few spots the seam allowance of the zipper band in place, just for it to lay nicely as well. That's it already for today's video. I hope you enjoyed and that I was able to explain everything well. And if there are any questions, just leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to help anybody. But before we get into the clips of me actually wearing this dress, I quickly wanted to ask you guys to hit the subscribe button and ring the bell so you get notified anytime that I post. I post on Sundays, so don't miss out on any videos. Go ahead and check out my channel if you haven't already. I have loads of videos on sewing, pattern making, draping, and in general designing. So I guess if you like this video, there are plenty of other ones just like this. I am trying to be more active lately on my Instagram and my TikTok, so if you haven't followed me there yet, go ahead and do that. The handle is exactly the same as here on YouTube, so if you're interested in behind the scenes, reels, and just some random videos about me and my cat, be sure to follow me there, especially on my Instagram. I am sharing loads of stuff like that. So thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'm gonna see you next Sunday. Bye guys!